Mahuta has been travelling the globe almost constantly this year, including to China, and she joins us now. Tēnā koe, te minita. Thanks for coming down to the program. Like a year ago on this program, we were giving you a hard time about not travelling. This year you've been to China, Sweden, Fiji, Japan, Singapore, Pacific. Is that because the PM told you to get moving?
Actually, it's because COVID borders have relaxed around the world and I've had the ability to travel, so I've made use of that opportunity and ensured that New Zealand's voice at this very complex time is reflected in a number of discussions that are significant and complex.
Was New Zealand's voice lost during COVID and lost for the fact that you weren't out there?
Look, online diplomacy is very different to in-person diplomacy, so getting out and across the globe to meet with countries and states to discuss New Zealand's interests within the context of a war in Ukraine, geopolitical tensions in our own region has been an important part.
Geopolitical tensions have ratcheted it up, haven't they, in the last year, substantially?
Undoubtedly they have.
OK. We seem to be great buddies with Australia again, because we need friends. There's the new citizenship deal, which has just been announced. But was that quid pro quo for us becoming more aligned with Australia in international relations?
Well, we've always valued the trans-Tasman relationship with Australia. It's one of our closest relationships.
Sure, but it was a bit frosty in recent years.
Actually, we've continued to work on a number of significant issues of common interest. We have close economic relations, the 40th year celebration, but also we've identified areas where there's been some tension in the relationship. With the change of government, we're now able to work through some of those tensions. OK, but the geopolitical stakes are also higher, aren't they? I mean, so not only our relationship with Australia, great, but, you know, we need to be alongside them and they are picking sides. Oh, look, what we need to do is continue to ensure that New Zealand's interests are taken account of as we look across our region and across the globe and position ourselves in a way that those interests will be served.
OK. It seems the pressure is on us. There was a high-ranking US official here and everybody's talking about AUKUS. Is the pressure on us to join AUKUS?
Look, we're not a part of the AUKUS arrangements. We've been very clear for our region that it's important to maintain peace and stability, that we retain our nuclear-free status, that we see no further militarisation in the region, and that for the Pacific, we recognise that there are ways that we can strengthen the security aspects, and climate change is our biggest security threat.
But in terms of AUKUS, does that mean that we're not going to be joining? Because we've been asked whether we want to talk about it.
Oh, look, we recognise that the members of AUKUS have made their determinations. We're not a part of those arrangements.
No, but we've been invited to talk about it, even joining the second pillar, which is like the technology and military capability pillar.
Look, on that, there's not enough visibility to understand the full impact of what the second pillar entails. The detail around that may be discussed at officials level, which I understand it has, but at a political level, it hasn't been discussed to the degree where we have enough visibility about what Pillar 2 fully entails.
Well, let's just be clear about where this is up to right now, because Andrew Little, the Defence Minister, says that we've been invited to talk about it, and the Deputy Prime Minister on this show last week seemed to be open about that second tier as well. Does that mean that it is going to go to Cabinet soon for a discussion, or are you saying that it's nowhere near that?
Look, I think we're somewhat away from the detail of what can be discussed. Exploring what that opportunity looks like and then making a decision as to whether or not New Zealand's interests are best served and engaging in Pillar 2 are two very different things, and we're some way away from having a level of detail to be able to discuss those issues fully. OK, some way away. What does that mean? What is the time frame? It means exactly what I said it means.
But some way away could mean like a couple of months, but there's pressure on. I mean, you met Secretary Blinken in Stockholm. Surely he talked about AUKUS to you.
Actually, the pressure is on AUKUS members to clarify what they mean in terms of Pillar 2 arrangements. We've been very clear we're not participating in the AUKUS arrangements. There are potentially opportunities in Pillar 2, but we don't have enough visibility to make a decision. And while officials may be talking about those issues, at a Cabinet level, we have no visibility on with a level of detail to have confidence that New Zealand's interests are served in those arrangements.
Because also something that Cabinet would have to consider from a national interest point of view, that even if you join the second tier of AUKUS as a technology but non-nuclear partner, it means we've picked a side.
Oh, look, let me be very clear New Zealand's independent foreign policy, first and foremost, puts its interests at the core of any decision that it makes. So I just want to be really clear about that.
Because there have been warnings from former heavyweight politicians like Helen Clark, Jim Bolger, Richard Prebble. They're all warning against the idea of joining AUKUS because it could be damaging to that independent foreign policy, which you just reiterated is so important.
Well, the independent foreign policy sends a number of signals. Firstly, we want to retain our nuclear-free status within the Pacific. We don't want to see any further militarisation within our region. We want to ensure that the Pacific voice is heard, of which New Zealand is a part of, that our greatest security threat is climate change, and that we need to corral those from outside of the region to join with the Pacific to ensure that our priorities are best met. The other element is to ensure that we strengthen the capacity for the Pacific to lean towards each other when it needs each other most.
Do you think the perception is that New Zealand's independent foreign policy is really more rhetoric than reality now because of this sort of pressure that's coming on to join things like AUKUS? The amount of time that you're spending with US officials, with UK officials, up in NATO.
No, I think New Zealand's independent foreign policy position continues to assert that we uphold the international rule of law and that we want to ensure that peace and stability is at the forefront of our considerations, and that we consider in tandem our foreign policy, our trade and our defence assessments from New Zealand's interests.
Okay, well,
and that is an important perspective to take forward
on defence
as we make our position known.
But on defence, like, you know, we've seen former high-ranking American military personnel employed here by Defence and GCSB. If we were truly independent, surely we'd see, say, former Chinese military personnel employed there as well. I mean, do we have those kinds of people here? That would be independent.
Oh, look, at an operational level, I'm not entirely sure what the makeup of our various departments are, but it's not an unusual situation. What I will say, though, is that foreign policy is determined by Cabinet, not by government agencies.
Former Prime Minister chose a side last year, didn't she? She's already chosen a side. In a statement with President Joe Biden, they both raised concerns about China's activities in the Pacific.
Actually, let's be very clear. Since former Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern took office, and now with our Prime Minister Chris Hipkins running our government, foreign policy is determined by Cabinet, not by government agencies.
Understand that, but the former Prime Minister and the President of the United States made a statement together raising concerns about China in the Pacific.
Oh, look, China has been in the Pacific for a long period of time. What New Zealand has continued to reinforce is that we don't see strategic rivalry in the Pacific serving the interests of our region. And in fact, New Zealand, by defending its independent foreign policy stance, we will continue to ensure that we make our assessments based on the interests of our region and our country. And what former Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern did is put fair and square in the centre of our assessments what will be the best for our region, and we stand alongside our Pacific partners.
All right, so part of the best interest for New Zealand is its trade with China, and you travelled to China in March, the first New Zealand Foreign Minister there since 2019. I think you've been pretty quiet about what happened up there.
No, actually, that's not the case.
Where's been the major speeches, the big sit-down interviews about what's been going on?
Well, I've actually got a speech coming up this week, and I'm looking forward to actually detailing the way in which we see New Zealand's independent foreign policy and how it relates to our Pacific region. But let me come back to the question around China.
Yeah.
Our relationship with China extends beyond trade and economics to people-to-people relationships and also our cultural connections. China has been in this region for a very long time. What we want to ensure is that China has a higher regard for the international rule of law and Pacific norms, which will not see the further militarisation of our region, which will continue to strengthen a climate change response, which is the response that the Pacific and New Zealand require.
And you have said that many times already.
Should be met.
Okay. What did the Chinese Foreign Minister ask you about? Did they ask about whether we were going to join AUKUS?
Look, I'm not going to disclose all the details of any bilateral conversation, but what I can say is that we did register the issues that we are most concerned about with China beyond trade and the economy and the human rights space, but also we drew the conversation towards the Pacific and identified why climate change is such an important issue that should be addressed.
Did you raise China's security pact with the Solomon Islands with that Foreign Minister?
The issue of the China
Solomon issue that you're talking about.
The issue of the China Solomon Islands Security Pact is a matter that has been raised both with the Solomons and China, to the extent that we don't think, with the Biktawa Declaration and the Bali Declaration, that it was necessary.
Right,
and in fact, policing across the Pacific is more attuned to the way in which New Zealand can support capacity building in that area rather than a defence policing strategy.
What about the war in Ukraine? Did you raise China's support of Vladimir Putin?
Actually, we're really clear with China that China could use its influence with Russia to see the cessation of war, to propose a peaceful approach which could include a return to internationally recognised boundaries and a de-escalation and a ceasefire to commence peaceful negotiations. But any outcome would require the Ukraine to agree to. So we've continued to urge China to use its influence with Russia.
Well, China does have influence there. I mean, President Xi visited. Is there any chance New Zealand could put sanctions on its largest trading partner because of its support for Vladimir Putin?
And I understand that President Xi and President Zelensky have had a conversation. So that's another positive move towards trying to figure out, is there an end point in the war in Ukraine? And we stand alongside many others to say we need to use our influence to the fullest extent possible, because nobody benefits from a protracted war. Nobody.
So there's no chance that we would consider sanctions against China because of its support for Vladimir Putin?
Actually, our sanctions regime is primarily focused on Russia and making sure that the economic and trade sanctions that we've used do not continue to fuel Russia's aggression against Ukraine.
Oh, well, let's talk about Taiwan. The British Foreign Secretary has just outlined his position on China. He was with you in Samoa recently, but he's warned about the military build-up, emphasising the Indo-Pacific in his speech. He says prudence dictates we should assume the worst. Do you assume the worst case scenario regarding Taiwan?
Well, two things. Firstly, because of the escalation of conflict in Sudan, the British Foreign Minister was not able to join me in Samoa. He returned to the UK.
Okay.
On his point in relation to Taiwan, that's certainly a matter for the UK and their determination. What New Zealand has said is that we do not want to see a departure from the status quo. We want negotiations between China and Taiwan to continue to occur so that democracy as currently exists can continue to be upheld.
Right, so, I mean, obviously a war doesn't suit anybody, OK, if that breaks out. So can we actually afford to pick sides? I mean, the Prime Minister wants a trade visit to China. That's so important to us, but that seems to have gone quiet. And I'm just wondering whether China is giving us the cold shoulder now because of all this other pressure that's coming on us to, say, join AUKUS.
Yeah, some of the difficulty with the public narrative is this idea that you should pick sides. Actually, New Zealand's independent voice, as small as it is, to promote the international rule of law and upholding the international rule of law and the maintenance of peace and stability, although it's a small voice, it's an important one. And we need to continue down that path because strategic rivalry in our region will not help anybody. Well,
that's right. Chris Hipkins and Anthony Albanese are both going to the NATO summit. You've just attended a NATO summit as Foreign Minister. I just wonder whether NATO is trying to forge an alliance down here as well.
Yeah, that's a really good question. NATO focused its efforts on the war in Ukraine, but also how to de-risk the relationship with China. Many of the European nations have China as a major trading partner, so they're all trying to grapple with how do you de-risk the relationship. The other thing to note that I thought was interesting is that you couldn't make the same assessments about China as was being made about Russia. Russia is not respecting the international rule of law. They are the aggressor in terms of the war in Ukraine, and they aren't listening to the international community.
Right. So you say it's a different case there. All right. Look,
well, actually, the European nations are saying that the treatment of China has to be with the clear-eyed view of de-risking their current relationship.
As we've mentioned, just finally, you've been travelling constantly, and you say you've got a speech next week. What and where is your next priority?
My priority is to ensure that New Zealand, being in and of the Pacific, that we continue to highlight that we want peace and stability to remain. Non-militarisation is an important part of our message, and retaining our nuclear-free status, but also climate change.
And are you confident
those are clear messages to the rest of the world as to how they might engage with the Pacific.
And you're confident that we can
partnering
maintain that independent track?
I am confident, and it's a small voice but an important voice at this very difficult and complex time. If we didn't think that our voice mattered, then we would be forced into choosing sides to a degree with which the only outcome could be an aggressive one or one that doesn't serve our interests. New Zealand must always hold its interests at the heart of any determination we make, whether it be foreign policy, trade, economics or defence. We have to balance our determinations across those three areas.
Foreign Minister Nanaia Mahuta, tēnā koe.
Thank you.